Time for another board meeting recap podcast. Dr. Smith, how are you today, sir?
Doing great, thanks.
So for this recap, we have a repeat visitor, special guest. We'll refer to him as Assistant Superintendent, Dr. Carl Underwood, Assistant Superintendent of Business Operations and Chief Financial Officer. So thank you for coming in, Carl.
Thank you.
So you're here, of course, because as we start moving through last night's agenda, we've got a lot of financial information, and we thought, let's bring you back. You've done this before, but really take a deep dive into some of the financial reports that you share and update our school board on. We always want to make sure that the public understands exactly what all these numbers mean. So we'll try to do a little review for them today. So we'll get to that shortly. So, Dr. Smith, we had a school board meeting last night. We started with good news. As always, recognize the fact we had another cause for applause winner this month in Thad Emmel, who's been a teacher at Perry Heights Middle School for 30 years. I know you know him not only as an employee of ours, but also on the parent side of things. So
Absolutely.
I know that was special.
Both my boys were blessed to have him as a teacher, so I've known him in that way. I think my first interaction with Mr. Emmel was when he visited the house to basically meet the parents of the individuals that were going to be in his homeroom that year. So that makes a pretty big impression, and just the outpouring of congratulatory remarks for him that numbered, I think, in excess of 200, I think is just emblematic of the kind of impact he's had for over 30 years.
Oh, it's so interesting, too, when you see some of our longtime educators like that, especially someone like that that has stayed in the same building. Of course, he's not only having children now that he hasn't had before, that maybe he had their parents as well. And we saw a lot of those social media comments, too. Loved having him as a teacher and thrilled to have him teaching my own children now.
Yep.
So very exciting. Also lifted up the fact last night, Dr. Smith, that a couple of exciting partnerships that we're going to be joining the 4T program with Toyota. That's going to impact Bossy High School. We'll be sharing more on that in the near future, but great opportunities for students there that have an interest in automobile design, manufacturing, and just what's involved with that. Also, our EVSC opt-in program, designated as an earned grant recipient. That stands for Employment Aid Readiness Network, and I know that's very important to them and to some of our business partners that they work so closely with. So
it is very important to our business partners. Actually, through that grant, the beneficiary really are the area businesses and then in turn our students, because it does help area businesses pay for part of the student's salary during their internship. So I think it's a win for the community, win for our students, and pretty exciting to see.
definitely. And it's just great to see how those really strong partnerships we have with these local businesses and employers working together with them to better our community and, as you said, our students. And then also did mention the fact last night that we recently finished our office facilities construction project, new tennis courts at Bossy High School, and they look fantastic.
They're gorgeous, yes.
Can't wait to have our student athletes.
I think we have drone video of the complete.
We do. We just posted that recently, drone footage. It really just ties in great with the entire athletic complex there with Enloe Stadium and the football field and Bossy High School, that beautiful venue. So long time coming on that project. We had to take a house down and really took over the road and made that part of the complex. But if you haven't seen that drone footage, you ought to look at that because it really is amazing looking.
I agree.
And that takes us then into the heart of the meeting last night, and you want to take us through consent items.
Be happy to. So you can access board docs either through our website, EVSC website, or actually you could just Google board docs and EVSC or Evansville Vandenberg School Corporation, which would take you there also. But if we would look then to item 2.02, consideration of allowance of payments, $16.3 million. And that really was a result of two primary drivers. First of all, we did the retro pay for our classified staff. So that would
And what do you mean when you say retro pay, Dr. Smith?
Well, we really, because of the law and how it impacts when we can enter into collective bargaining with our teachers, that delays everything, not only for teachers, but for all of our employees. So by the time the contract was settled and then all of the retroactive pay was determined, our classified staff actually had 14 pays, I believe, that they had already received for the school year that then we would go back and retroactively provide their pay increase for them. And that is a very complicated process, specifically this year, because We were blessed to receive more state funding for this biennium, and we're very, very grateful for that. So we didn't just say, here's a 2% increase or 4%. We actually went back in, and for instance, with bus drivers, we were then able to shift from a daily rate to an hourly rate. Well, imagine if you would, going back 7 months when they were not tracking their hours from on an hourly basis. They were tracking them on a daily basis and having to adjust that payroll times 14. That really was almost a person by person hand calculation. So just a lot of effort. And one of the things that I did in continued business was just provided a shout out for our folks in payroll and business affairs. They did an incredible job to get all of that uh, taken care of in a way that's very, very accurate.
And
So
really, it all was finalized then and paid out here in January. Our teachers, principals, counselors, the first pay, and then our non-teach staff in the second pay of
right,
the month. But like you said, the amount of work it takes, because you got to get that right. That's not something that you
absolutely.
can just
Yeah.
estimate. That's for sure.
Then also on that $16.3 million is a $2.4 million insurance payment for health insurance. So those two things uh, acted in tandem to raise that allowance of payments slightly higher than what we were typically used to seeing. Then we will look at item 2.03, consideration approve the purchase of items from extracurricular account. Central High School is going to purchase some microphones for their auditorium. That auditorium is a gorgeous facility and used quite a bit. So I appreciate Central High School once again taking care of that.
And while we're talking finances more in depth this particular podcast, Dr. Smith, when we look at that and we see a request on a school board meeting for a school to purchase items out of their extracurricular funds, why do you see that on this as opposed to Central just going out and purchasing a microphone system or a sound system?
Well, actually, twofold. First of all of our purchasing is governed by the State Board of Accounts. And secondly, we also have a resolution that requires any school that's going to purchase funds from their extracurricular accounts to have board approval for anything that's over $500, because that then actually becomes property of the school corporation. We have to tag and make certain that the inventory is such for audit purposes.
Okay, makes sense.
Then moving on to item 2.04, consideration of the request to carry over 2021 encumbered but unexpended appropriations. So
Explain that if you would, please.
that's why we have Carl here. But actually, well,
Right.
I'll take a stab at it, and then Carl, if you would clean up anything that I misspeak. But frankly, I think if you liken this to your household budget, there are a couple things that I think are very common to folks. One term would be budget, the other would be like expenditures. So a budget is when you sit down and think, okay, this is the kind of income I'm going to have. So this is the budget that I will develop in association with that income to pay for either rent or mortgage or
Groceries,
utilities,
utilities, you name
right?
it.
Water, all of those things. Um, so that would be a budget. We also know that a budget, um, I guess in theory, you can make up any number for a budget, but you have to have the money to support the revenue, the income to support that that budget when you come out or actually pay your bills. So I think those two things, budget and expenditures, are pretty straight ahead. We also have to operate with appropriations. So appropriations, simply put, would be the authority to spend the funds provided that you have the cash to back it up. So what we have right now is that we have unexpended appropriations. So we have a spending level, if you will, that we haven't spent.
We haven't
Okay,
made the purchase yet.
right,
Yeah, so yeah, they're really goods and services that are being held by a purchase order or a contract that have not been realized by the end of 2021. So it
But
may
we know
be
they're coming.
they know they're coming. So it could happen in 2022, but they're going to be purchased with
yeah.
funds that were appropriated in 2021.
And when we're talking for asking for permission, you're talking about from our elected school board, correct?
Yes, and frankly, the Department of Local Government Finance provides an appropriation level. So, tagging
Okay.
along with what Carl said, we want to make certain that we use funds that we've received in 2021 for expenses that really were occurred in 2021. Sometimes that billing lags behind a little bit. If we purchase certain goods or services in December of 2021, sometimes the billing then comes to us in 2022. Well, we have to close out our fiscal year December 31st, which is the same as a calendar year. So basically, we ask for permission to carry over the permission to spend 2021 funds in 2022.
Okay. Makes
Simply put.
sense. Complicated maybe when you first hear it, but once you explain it like that, it does make sense.
Well, let's hope. And then moving on to item 2.05. This is consideration to approve the resolution for the transfer of appropriations within the 2022 budget. That's why I took a little bit more time with item 2.04. While that is moving appropriations from one fiscal year to the next, this is really moving appropriations or spending levels within the 2022 budget. So basically, and I don't know if we can put that up on the screen, but Carl, could you walk us through? So, why would we need additional appropriation levels for summer school or for school administration?
Sure. So, in looking at the education fund, the summer school programs, this operates very much like a grant. It is not budgeted for because it is a reimbursement. We receive reimbursement for those expenses from the state. So, the appropriation level is not there.
So let me back up. When you say the appropriation level isn't there, we do have the funds to pay those bills.
Certainly have the funds.
Okay.
We just did not budget for that as it is a reimbursement type account.
And since we didn't budget for it, we don't have permission to spend funds for that particular purpose unless we go through this process.
Correct.
Okay.
So I think it would be accurate if you're listening to this discussion to your takeaway should be that none of this happens without going through the proper process, the channels. In the business office, you're not just writing checks, you're not just paying things, doing changes to the budget without going through the prescribed steps as laid out in statute or by local government finance, through our school board, all of that. There are steps in place to make sure this is done correctly.
Procedures in place through the Department of Local Government Finance, the State Board of Accounts, and the EVSC Board of School Trustees. So policies and procedures are followed at all times.
Yeah.
Okay.
So then, why did we need additional allocation of funds for school administration?
That's due because for health insurance, as you know, in this past school year, we raised the portion that the school corporation contributed for our employees, and our school principals were one of them. So the appropriation that we originally budgeted for was not enough because we made a larger contribution. So this is the process by which we shake all of those appropriations out at the end of the school year.
So, not to belabor this, but our budget process actually started in February and March of the previous year.
Yes.
Actually, for these funds, a year and a half ago.
Yes.
And we do that based upon trend data. So, when we looked at our spend for health insurance, when we developed the budget, it was at one level. Unfortunately, last year, because of COVID primarily, it jumped up to another level. So even through our best predictive and through our best analysis, we were a little bit short in the funds that we had approval to spend on health insurance. So we needed to raise that level in order to be able to pay all of our insurance bills.
That's exactly right.
Okay, so then when we go to operations, if you could just briefly touch on those three areas.
Sure. So, in looking at those accounts, some of them, if you're looking at the general administration account, that was an appropriation for our negotiations for legal services. So, the need for legal services, the appropriation amount was greater than what we had originally anticipated. For the central services, that was in large part due to a change in our GAAP accounting. We had to spend more in that area than what we had originally planned for, as well as a repayment to IDOE for services for our food services account.
So let me just clarify that. In the past, and we had gone through numerous audits where that had been approved by the State Board of Accounts, but we have food service. Well, so we have cafeterias. That means that they need to be cleaned. So the portion of time through the time and effort logs for custodians that they spent in the cafeterias, cleaning the cafeterias, taking out the trash, doing all those things that are necessary and vital to maintain a food service enterprise in our schools, we actually charged that time to the food service account, which makes good sense. What would a restaurant do? they would do the same thing. So, and that was a permissible expense. Then through changes that came about, then that was no longer allowed. So then we had to basically refund that money back to them.
That's correct.
And we had the funds, but we didn't have the permission to pay the funds. So this is just simply asking for permission to repay those or to pay those funds out of that different account.
That's right. And then lastly, the building acquisition, construction, and improvement. This was the payoff of our guaranteed energy savings account for McCutcheonville. At the time, we didn't know exactly what the appropriation level was going to be. And by the time we figured it out, the budget process had already started. So it was just a small amount there as well.
Yeah. So once again, that's timing because this budget was developed starting a year and a half ago.
Correct.
And once again, if people are curious as to McCutcheonville and what all of that was, we have learned throughout the years when we have built many buildings that there is a team of engineers that will design the HVAC system. Then there would be groups that would install the systems, and then we would also have that commissioned. So in other words, does everything work as it was designed and installed to? We've had some issues in the past, frankly, in building projects where we had some concerns that the HVAC systems were not working as we desired. They were not working as we were told they would, but yet the designers would point the finger at the installers and the installers would point the finger at the designers. So basically, we entered into an energy savings contract for design, build, and commissioning so that if there were any issues at McCutcheonville, there was just one point that we had to contact. And fortunately, that system's working beautifully. So I think it is a way for us to continue, if we have building projects in the future, to continue to operate that way because we then actually truly do get the product and the services that we request.
And I think it's interesting, too, when you talk about that in depth, Dr. Smith, to see the overlap and the connections between the different departments of a large entity like EVSC, because we're talking about the budget. But now you're bringing into aspects that certainly fall under our Office of Facilities Department as they're working with construction projects. But if you all aren't communicating and on the same page, then it's not going to end up where we want it because all of this really is connected.
Correct. So if we could put this back up on the screen, please. The first half, as you will see, are those two funds, and I'll just read it. Now, therefore, be it resolved by the Board of School Trustees of the Evansville Vanderbilt School Corporation, Vanderbilt County, Indiana, that the expenses of said municipal corporation, the following appropriations are hereby increased in the following amounts. So now if we could scroll down to the bottom of that page, now this section reads, whereas it's been shown that certain existing appropriations now have unobligated balances, which will not be needed for the purposes for which appropriated, it is further resolved that the following existing appropriations be reduced in the following amounts. So you will see that on the top half, $860,597.38 were additional levels of spending that were needed to fulfill our obligations. On the bottom, you will see the same amount now is being shifted from areas where we did not have to spend that much money, even though we had the authority to. We're shifting that authority up to the top where we needed the authority, the permission to spend the cash that we already had.
That's exactly right.
And as we've said, following the procedures, the processes that are laid out to make all of that happen, not just doing that on a whim, so to speak, and moving it around, following everything as it's designed to happen so that our board is fully abreast of everything happening.
Yeah. So I know that took a little bit of time to explain, but these are things that I think typically people would not understand. And sometimes when it's not very clear, then sometimes it becomes suspect. But all of this is laid out in statute. It's laid out through the State Board of Accounts. And it's not as though we are creating more money. We are just moving, just like you would in your household budget. If your utility bill is a little bit higher, then you may have to shift some money for entertainment, for instance, into pay that utility bill. That's kind of what we do, although we have to have permission in order to do that.
And when you talk about going more in depth on this topic today, Dr. Smith, you've never shied away from the fact that we take our financial responsibility very, very seriously, and we want to be very strong in the aspect of being fiscal stewards of the money that we're dealing with to provide an education to the children of Vandenberg County.
We absolutely do. And I think as evidence from that, not only are all of our financial records online through board docs, but I think it's important for these podcasts to take time to explain why certain things exist. So now individuals can go back. I think board docs goes back to 2008.
I think so.
So you can go back 14 years and see these same kinds of resolutions and these same kinds of legal resolutions that have been passed by previous boards, because it is a process that has been required for as long as I've been in this type of position.
Okay. All right. We'll keep moving through.
Okay. And then item 2.06, which is consideration approve the change order number 1 with Lehman Roofing for the Harrison High School roof replacement project of 2021. So basically what we have done is we have put, let's see, I guess we have put amounts in the contracts so that we would not have to go back and ask for change orders. So, and unfortunately, the word escapes me now that I'm looking at, or looking for, but there's a deduction, for instance, here of $1,750 because it was not needed. So there is an allowance. Thank you. That's the word I was looking for, that we put allowances in so that we don't always have to go back to the board for increases or for change orders. So this is basically the final change order, to where since we did not use all that allowance, it comes back as a deduction. And then this final change order will then be the final price.
And really, all that's the result of thorough planning, all of our
Right.
construction projects, in-depth knowledge, our Office of Facilities, Daryl Langermeyer, understanding what potential things could happen in any project and planning accordingly.
Yes. So if you could just put up on the screen this attachment, and then you will see number 3, prices above subtracted from the allowance. That's what I was referencing. So there was a specific allowance put in. We didn't need all of that to be done, because once you tear a roof off, sometimes you get into situations that you don't know you're going to get into. So there are allowances made. Since we did not spend all the money in that particular allowance, then it comes back as a change order and as really a deduct.
Okay.
So thank you for putting that up on the screen. And then finally, under consent, item 2.07, consideration approve the change order number 1 with Art Construction for Bossy High School tennis courts project. That's the project that we referenced in Good News. So, and I think, Jason, you also alluded to this. Basically, there was part of the street that now we have.
Kind of
as
a
part
dead
of
end part of the street that
Right.
didn't connect with 41 but came close to it.
Right. Well, there were underground utilities of which the city was not even aware. So naturally, that takes some funds to make certain that they're capped off and secured as they should be. And additionally, you referenced a house that was on the property that we did purchase and then take down. It had a basement, and we filled the basement. Certainly, when they did the compaction study, it was found that we needed to dig some of that out and make certain that that soil was compacted at a greater level. So those were just a few of the change
And
orders.
if you take a look at the screen,
Oh,
Dr. Smith,
perfect.
you'll see we've got some of that drone footage. And
Yeah.
previously, correct me if I'm wrong, not only were our courts getting to the point where they needed to be updated and replaced, I believe we had 3 tennis
We
courts
did.
at Bossy High School. And as you can see from this footage now, we've been able to expand that. So we have not only brand new courts, but we have 5 tennis courts, which, if you're not a fan of tennis or your children haven't been involved in that, allows more matches to take place at the same time instead of matches going later because one is after the
And
other.
if we could return to that video, I know I'm asking a lot of our tech department here, but you'll notice that there are no lights here. And that was very important. The Lakenshire Homeowners Association were great to work with. That is, that's just an incredible neighborhood.
Kind of a historic neighborhood, really.
Absolutely. So you will see that there are no lights here, because that would really have, I think, detracted from the value of that historic neighborhood. So in order to accomplish tennis matches while it's still daylight, we have 5 courts, which will allow us to get all of our matches in.
And love the way the red matches
Yes.
the red on the track around the football, through the football stadium. So, yeah, great, great project there.
Yes, certainly is. So most of that, in terms of change orders, we're making certain that the soil was compacted. It also extended a curb at the appropriate height to level, and then some of the underground utilities that uh, all the best preparation, all the schematics and all the drawings that we reviewed still did not indicate that there were water lines and other things there under the street that we now have.
And
So
I know anytime we do construction projects, when you talk about that soil compact, making sure that that is appropriate, because we're not just looking to have a project that looks great when you unveil it. We want these tennis courts to look just as good and be such a strong playing surface 10, 15 years from now, too. We don't want settling resulting in cracking.
certainly agree. Daryl Angermeyer, Chief Facilities Officer, does a great job with that. Jay Smith, the architect from Fawcett Associates on this, has a real passion for Bosse High School, for Enlow Field. Um, so I think the resulting project is one that's going to be beautiful and functional for years and years to come. So hats off to Daryl and his crew, as well as Jay Smith.
Definitely. And that takes us then into consideration of personnel recommendations. And I know you'll hit on this, but we actually have two parts to that last night.
We certainly do, and people can open that up and look at that at your leisure. We also hired a school resource officer, and Mr. Seibert has been 6 years on the on the sheriff's
I believe it was the Henderson
Henderson
Police
County. That's
Department
right,
for
6
6
years,
years.
20 years with EPD, and within that 20-year span, he was also a liaison officer at one of our high schools. So he has the right demeanor. School resource officers are there to help students with a sense of belonging, for relationship building, for a trusted adult to confide in if there are concerns that they have. Uh, so those ongoing and embedded relationships are very, very important for us, and I know he will do a great job.
That and these are such important positions, and I know just in talking to Officer Seibert, not only did he speak about his previous longtime police experience, but he's also been extremely active in coaching youth
Yes.
sports, and so really talked about his desire to make connections with kids, and that's what our resource officers do a phenomenal job of.
You are correct, and we are blessed to have outstanding resource officers.
Definitely. That takes us then into two action items from last night.
And I'll do this in fairly quick order because these were on the previous board meeting as
Yes.
information items. They advanced without any changes. So, item 4.01, consideration to award the contract for Highland Elementary School lower level finish flooring. That was awarded to, Razor Flooring.
Raise your
Yes.
floor covering.
Don't know why those things are escaping me right now. And then item 4.02, uh, putting in a new chiller for Plaza Park. There's quite a long lead time for chillers for large HVAC systems. So that will be installed over the summer, as will the flooring.
Definitely. And then that takes us into the information items. And Dr. Smith, if you would, you want to cover the first two, and then we'll turn it over to Dr. Underwood for the remaining items.
Certainly. So item 5.01 is consideration to award the contract for Harrison High School's auditorium HVAC replacement in 2022 in the summer. So there is a recommendation that Darrell put forward to the board, and then so they will have 2 weeks to question and to do some further investigation. And then if they are satisfied with it, then it moves forward as an action item. And the same would be true for item 5.02, which is contract for Culver Family Learning Center HVAC upgrade.
And, I think it's interesting too, and we've talked about this before, when you look at these two items and what you just discussed previously, not every construction project is as glitzy as the tennis courts. Those look phenomenal, but our Office of School Facilities also spends so much time and effort making sure, as you just talked about, our chillers are up and running and replaced when they should be, our HVAC systems, our floor covering, that's a little more visible. But all of those things, when you have so many facilities like we do, I believe 50 if you count all of our facilities approximately, a lot of things have to be done, not just those projects that are so bright and shiny like new tennis courts.
And if I remember correctly, last night, Trustee Word asked Daryl Angermeyer about the filtration of air.
She
and
did,
do
yes.
these systems use the latest and greatest technology. And through Daryl's leadership, we now have enhanced filtration systems on all of our schools, as well as O2 Prime, and I think about a third of our schools. So anytime we bring in and bring on additional or new HVAC changes, we always look at the air quality of our buildings, the exchange rate, all of those things that are very, very important in terms of air quality.
Absolutely. So then that takes us to item 5.03 and really through 5.09. So, Dr. Underwood, if you would, I know you did this last night and you do this on a monthly basis, not every one of these, but several of these. And clearly, we're taking really kind of a deep dive, in depth look at uh, some of the financial aspects in this particular podcast. So, if you would just start and take us through that, I may ask you some clarifying questions. Dr. Smith, I know with his expertise, may jump in as well, because we really want people to understand what they're looking at here and what type of things you're updating the board on at these monthly updates.
Sure. So just wanted to say thank you to Courtney Bolivar, Director of Budget, who's able to put these reports together, the monthly, quarterly, and yearly. And you'll see the end of year financial report for the board to see. She does a great job in all of this while managing an audit that we're currently going under, and then also overseeing the new contract pay for certified and non-certified employees and making sure all that runs smoothly. So a big thank you to her.
Absolutely.
This was a great year for the business department. We were able to close out the financial year 2021 and open 2022 up the first day back, returning from Christmas holiday break. So big thank you to Courtney and her staff in the business affairs department.
And
Most
that
definitely.
doesn't just happen.
It does
Because,
not just happen.
people think, okay, so schools are on winter break or Christmas break. Well, while the schools may be, I guarantee you, central office is not. That is a very, very, very busy time.
And really, our business office is fairly small when you think about it with the size of our entity. It's not like you have 100 people working on this.
It
I
is-
mean, this is a small group of people that are looking over things so closely and carefully.
It's a small department that has to work well together, and Courtney, as the director, does an amazing job overseeing all of this work. So
Well
thank
said.
you to her. And looking at these reports, so we have month end, and then we have a year end financial report as well as a quarterly analysis, and we'll kind of go through those one by one. The 5.03, the Education and Operations Fund monthly review. This is our review as of the end of December 2021. And again, if you look at that, it's the same layout as we present every month. You've got a look at your expenditures, your percentage of expense compared to the prior year. And so in looking at these, expenditures were expected. We have a little bit of a variance in both the education and operations funds because we're making use of our federal dollars from ESSER. And so some
And
salary
let's stop there and talk
expense-
about ESSER. When we say ESSER, I know we use that term so much because we're so accustomed to it. Either one of you want to talk about what is it we mean when we say ESSER funding?
Those are really funds that we are very, very grateful to receive from the federal government, then through the state government, basically to mitigate the impact that the pandemic has had on our students. So there are a variety of uses for those funds, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of air quality. So what activities can we take on in order to get our kids back into school, but safely? Well, good quality, air quality, and good exchange of air is very important for an airborne disease such as COVID. Additionally, any of our mitigation strategies that require like PPE, personal protective equipment, so masks, those kind of things, shields, we purchased through ESSER funds. But then also, and that those funds came through us in three different series, if you would: CARES 1, and then ESSER 1 and ESSER 2. And each time, the requirements, I would say the requirements built upon the previous funding. So in the last funding round, what I call ESSER 2 or ESSER 3, 25% of those funds had to be dedicated specifically to learning loss. So that is another huge bucket of expenditures that we want to make certain that we utilize, not only just for the short term time period that the ESSER funds are here. I think all of the ESSER funds, the CARES funds, I think have to be finished up by later this year.
Correct.
Then ESSER 1 or ESSER 2, the second round, I think next year, and then the final round would be then a year after that.
So these federal funds were not just given to schools around the country and saying, put this in your account, spend it on what you want, when you want for the next 5-10 years. It was
No.
not something like that.
These funds actually operate as a grant. So before we expend any of these funds, we have to get permission from folks up at the Indiana Department of Education. And then once they approve them, then we can put the wheels in motion then to either purchase the goods or the services or what have you. We know that learning loss is going to last beyond the time frame that this money has been provided to us. So what we are doing is trying to, what I have said several times on these podcasts and other places, is create a longer runway so that we will be able to access these funds or funds from this grant process for at least a decade, because we think, and I think there's research now that's pretty compelling that will back that up, that the impact of the pandemic is going to be very long lasting. We do know how we can help students, but we want to make certain that we have enough time period and enough of those funds to spend in year 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 to make certain that we can lessen the damaging impact of the pandemic.
And I think it's interesting too when you said we have to have permission to make sure we're using these funds as they're prescribed. We've all been in meetings. I've heard you say countless times when we've discussed possible items to fund with these ESSER dollars, and you've looked at Deputy Superintendent Belinda Stubbs and said, Dr. Stubbs, can you contact who her contact is and make sure this is an acceptable use of the funds? We have that discussion all the time.
It seems like we have that discussion at least weekly. Yes.
Yes.
So once again, I just want to make certain that everybody understands that these are funds that A, we have to have permission to spend, but B, we want to make certain that they last a long time. So you will see, for instance, on the slide that was just up, last year in the education fund, we spent $136 million. This year, it looks like we spent nearly $132 million. The reality is that we still spent at least $136 million as we did the previous year. But out of this specific fund, the education fund, we spent less. So we're able to save those funds, as I said, to expand and to elongate that runway so that the kinds of initiatives that we're putting in place that we know are beneficial for students will last long enough for them to have the positive benefit to hopefully blunt the impact of the pandemic.
Yeah.
Okay.
To your point, Dr. Smith, as you'll see, the cash balances in both the education and operations funds have increased, and that is largely due to shifting that salary expense from those funds to our federal dollars.
Okay.
So it's a good, I was going to say problem. It's a good situation to have, but it requires, once again, another layer of work to make certain that we're tracking those funds so that we can differentiate funds from the education fund, the operations fund, and then the federal funds that we are saving for use beyond the time period.
And it goes without saying, we certainly do appreciate the fact that the federal government understood that there were going to be serious impacts to learning, teaching, learning, and education in general as a result of this terrible pandemic. And so thank goodness that ESSER dollars were provided. And it's not just to Hoosier schools or to local Evansville schools. I mean, this is to school districts
Right.
throughout the entire United States.
And it was really based upon your Title I allocation. So there's a pretty exact formula of how those funds were distributed.
Okay.
If moving on to the next report is our summary of cash balances by fund, and this will highlight just kind of what we've been talking about. You'll see the cash balances, in particular to the education and operations funds, are increased over the prior year, and this is in part due to the shift of the salary expense from those funds to our federal dollars by way of CARES or ESSER.
Okay. And as always, I'll just throw this in, Dr. Underwood. Everything you're referencing that's on the screen is on Board Docs. So anyone who wants to click on this and peruse through this information certainly is invited to do so.
Absolutely.
So, Carl, if you would, can you talk a little bit about debt service? Because at the beginning of the year, beginning cash balance of $4.5 million, and then the adjusted balance on the right-hand side, the month to date, only $417,000. What happened?
Yeah, so unique thing this year, we were able to take advantage of the protected tax waiver, which allows school districts to shift some of the loss from property tax caps from the operations fund to its debt service fund, which in turn allows you or school districts to do more with the dollars in operations, whether that would be through capital projects or bus transportation, allows you to use those dollars in a better way in that particular year. That is a huge benefit. The con to that is that we took advantage of that this year and our cash balance has decreased. So it's unlikely that we would be able to take advantage of that if we were to qualify next year. We'd have to wait a little bit until our cash
Right.
reserve in that particular fund increases to
But
a level to be able to do that again.
the good news is that the property tax cap, the negative impact was blunted from other funds, for instance, in our operations fund, because we were able to take out, because of that protected tax waiver, funds that were in our debt service fund. So just as a reminder, not to belabor this, but in Indiana, there's actually a constitutional amendment
Yes.
that caps your property taxes for a residential homeowner at 1% of your net assessed valuation.
Yes.
So if your property taxes are more than that 1%, you don't pay that. But yet our budgets and our appropriations are based upon your full tax bill. So if your tax bill is capped at $1,000, but yet because of the 1% property tax cap for residential, but yet your tax bill would have been $1,250. All of that, our budget is based upon that $1,250 initially, and then you'll see in subsequent slides that we have a collections rate that was in the upper 80% because that $250 does not come to us because the property tax cap for residential is at 1%. So you're capped at 1%. I think rental property and farmland is 2%, and then business is capped at 3%.
That's right.
And you made sure to clarify last night with the board, Dr. Smith. I think both of you hit on this. Certainly don't want to imply that Vandenberg County residents aren't paying taxes. It's not that. When you look
Correct.
at this documentation and you notice a change in a shortfall, if you want to call it that, it is not because people didn't pay. It's, again, because of
Right.
these caps that I guess the state put in to protect property owners from surprises and increases in property
Mhm.
taxes.
So, and for us this year, I think that resulted in about a $9 million
It's really close to
loss.
9 million.
Yeah.
Yes.
In what our budget was approved for, but we were not able to collect about $9 million because of those property tax caps. So hopefully that makes sense.
No, I think that helps.
Okay. Moving to the next report. This is our, again, a report you see each month, our expenditure ledger. This is a breakdown of all of our expenses by function and object code. We are required by State Board of Accounts to use codes and account numbers that are consistent across all districts. And this is just a report showing what our expenses are.
Okay. And that information, of course, is on there as well. So feel free to take a look at that.
Next, followed by our revenue report. This is a look at revenue for the month of December for the past 2 years. And again, it's just a kind of a check and a balance for us to look to see are there any true variances regarding our revenue. Things that would impact revenue would be number of students, our ADM, which is where our money for our education fund comes from. And then on our other funds, our operations funds would be our property tax collection. So you'll see some changes in numbers there. They could be impacted by a number of different things, number of students, and whether or not we have a different change in budget.
And I would imagine, as a chief financial officer, Dr. Smith, as a superintendent, this would be information that certainly you both are monitoring closely to see how things may or may not have changed over a 2-year period.
Absolutely. So if you could put that up on the screen and then scroll down to the next page. Carl, talk to me a little bit about miscellaneous fees, 1741. So in 2020, we ended up the year with $1.9 million worth of miscellaneous fees. And then last year, $2.8 million, $860,000 more last year. Why is that?
Yeah, I wish I could say that that was money that just came out of nowhere. But really, it was an impact from 2020, the pandemic.
Right.
Our daycare, our We Care programs, those are revenue-based programs. For the last 3 months of the year were shut down, so we were not collecting revenue. This year, those are thankfully back open and running, and so you'll see a difference in the revenue there.
Yes. So I think we've noted numerous times that in those revenue-producing kinds of programs, the revenue stopped, but our expenses continued because we made certain that every employee continued to be paid throughout the pandemic. And I know that's so important for our employees, for our families, but I think that just shows you that $860,000 more revenue was also revenue that was lost in 2020, even though our expenses continued.
And I know as leadership of the corporation, as our board of school trustees, that was a priority for us in terms of making sure that our employees could count on the fact that during the height of the pandemic, even in shutdown periods, they were not going to lose money out of paychecks.
Absolutely was a priority of us and our board. They wanted to
Definitely.
make certain that salaries continued for our employees, not only for our employees and our families, but also so that continued to generate growth in our community.
Okay. I think then pick up where you left off, if you would, Dr. Underwood.
Okay, so now we move into our 2-year expenditure analysis. Again, just to look at our expenses over the past 2 years. A report that highlights some of the changes that you would have seen from COVID, from the pandemic in 2020 as well. Again, Courtney and I monitor this and look at. We're looking at huge variances. A big thing would be whether or not we've had a shift in health insurance. We had more of a spend on the corporation side, and so that would be reflected in certified and non-certified salaries as well.
Okay. Next, we have 5.08.
And now the big report.
Yeah, so this is our end of year 2021 report.
Looks like something that you've presented before.
It's the similar format as in previous years. Share this out with the board. We always like to get it in the first month of the new year, and it's just kind of a look back at our finances for the prior year for 2021. So if you kind of run through the slide there, this is the slide that Dr. Smith was referring to. In 2021, you look at your shortfall amount in property tax collection history, and a point again is this is not saying that residents of Vanderbilt County didn't pay taxes. Right. This is almost entirely the result of property tax caps that are in state statute. So again, to Dr. Smith's point, almost $9 million we know going into the year we were not going to collect.
And you know that that's not going to change moving forward. So I assume as you're planning future budgets, you will always know this is something you have to contend with.
We receive an estimate from the Department of Local Government Finance. When we begin to start putting the budget together, we know, and in this, for the coming year, it's going to be about $9 million again. So we know we're not going to collect that revenue.
So when you think about this in totality, our net assessed valuation in Vanderbilt County is $7.1 billion.
Yes.
So we probably have a shortfall of about $200,000 or so in taxes that were not paid, which is, I think, outstanding. So as you said, just want to continue to make certain people understand, residents of Vanderbilt County, they were blessed. They pay their property taxes. This $9.1 million shortfall is a result of the property tax caps.
Yes.
Okay, we can keep moving through this.
So then we start to look at the revenue and expenses for our education fund. The budget for 2021 was just over $140 million. You look at the revenue there of $161.6 million. That looks out of balance, but that is because of the shift we went through a couple of years ago when the state removed the general fund and went to the education and operations fund. About $30 million expenses from our education fund our general fund at that time were moved to the operations fund, and then so it only makes sense that we are going to shift some of the revenue that we receive from the state over to cover those expenses in the operations.
And once again,
fund.
This wasn't an EVSC centric type of move. This impacted all 292 districts in the state.
Yes.
When the state went away from the general fund and then the tax levy funds, then they said, no, it's just going to be the education fund and the operations fund, but yet they still continued to fund us in the same way and then required us to transfer money out of the education fund to cover previously generated funds or expenses from the general fund.
Exactly. And so, in going through that, you have a prior year cash balance. You see down there the transfers to the operation fund. The budget was built on transferring $22 million of state revenue to the operations fund, and that's highlighted there. And then ending the year with our operating balance of $16.4 million. Going back to the cash summary report, again, a large The increase in that is in large part due to the shift of salary expenses to our federal ESSER dollars.
And many times, Jason, you've spoken to the regulation, the high number of regulations that we have. So, Carl, could you talk a little bit about we are capped technically at the amount of funds that we can transfer out of the education fund into the operations fund?
Yeah, so the states implemented a 15% threshold that they want school districts to be able. That's the most that they're wanting school districts to transfer over. And if a school district is needing to transfer more than that, that kind of sends an alert to the state that they need to begin looking at their finances to make sure that things are not out of balance.
And Carl, for somebody listening to this thinking, how in the world do they stay on top of all this? That's a good question. How do you and your colleagues in the business office, and Dr. Smith for that matter, stay abreast of changes that are going to impact our planning purposes for budgets and expenses?
So we receive communication regularly from the state, from IDOE. Courtney and I also monitor things from the business office, the Indiana School Corporation of Business Officials. We receive word from them. We also have people that we work with, attorneys in Indianapolis and locally, that keep us abreast of all of those changes.
Okay, so it's really incumbent on us to monitor and to stay in touch and follow these lines of communication to make sure that we're always aware of the latest changes.
It is. It changes frequently, and you need to keep on top of it.
Okay.
So, just one thing that I wanted to interject, really, when I wanted you to talk a little bit about that 15%, what I would call cap. So, what is the major expense that we have in the education fund?
It's people,
People. And specifically, it would be
teachers.
teachers. We want to pay our teachers the absolute most we can pay them. So, on one hand, that is a driving force for us, and I would think every school corporation. On the other hand, then you have certain expenses that you have to continue to pay out of your operations expense. So there is somewhat of a competing interest there, if you will, that I think is just an interesting dynamic. So nothing is necessarily easy. But
Well, and you both have talked before, and I think you mentioned it last night, Carl, to the board that certain districts, if they're not careful, not that we're perfect, but we strive to be as diligent as possible with all of this, so we're not casting stones here. But it's a system set up that districts could get themselves in trouble if they started moving too much money and then were left with expenses they couldn't cover down the road. Is that fair?
Yeah, it is. There's a new report that has been in play the last couple of years, a fiscal indicator report that's generated by the state, and it looks at things that might trip up school districts. One would be any serious or rapid decline in enrollment or cash balances in major funds. That would be a trigger for the state to begin to looking to see if they're a district that might be in fiscal trouble.
Okay. All right. We'll keep looking at this report then.
So next, you look at the operations fund. Again, similar setup as all the other funds. Our budget was set at $80.5 million, revenue of $48.5 million, with a cash balance of $14.2 million. You're seeing the $22 million. That was the transfer in from the education fund as revenue. And then we had expenses of $59 million, leaving an operating balance of $23.8 million. Again, a large cash balance, a large increase, but it's due to the shift of our salary expenses to the federal dollars.
And I'm not sure if we've said this today. We've talked about it in the past many times, but if you haven't heard that, again, just to make sure we're on the same page, Education Fund, Operations Fund. Education Fund, we're talking, I guess, think school classroom expenses for lack of a better way of describing it. Operations Fund, those things that are necessary to support our organization but aren't in the classroom. They're not teachers. Bus transportation, Office of Facilities, Supportive Services, Food Service, that type of thing.
Exactly.
utilities, insurance, actually superintendent, assistant superintendents. So there are a lot of expenses that you need. You need to heat your buildings and cool your
You need
buildings
to put
and
roofs
water.
on. You need to get kids to school
Right.
on buses. Yes.
Essential for operations, but not deemed in the education vein. And just one thing I want to point out. So the $22 million that we transferred in from the education fund is not considered revenue in that 2021 revenue line.
Correct.
Okay.
Okay, we'll keep moving.
Looking at the debt service fund, this is where we pay our debt obligations. had our budget of 15 million, collected the revenue of the 11 million. With a prior cash balance, and then taking advantage of the protected tax waiver, like we mentioned earlier, leaving a cash balance of just over $400,000.
And that takes us to rainy day.
Rainy day fund. So once again, we were fortunate enough to be able to transfer or sweep $500,000 from our operations fund into our rainy day fund, bringing that balance to just over $8.9 million.
And if you would, Carl, say again, rainy day fund, what do you mean by that?
So it's a fund that the Board of School Trustees can designate to use for whatever purpose that they so desire. We use it as a way to store cash reserves along with our education fund. I know Dr. Smith will remember this vividly. Any kind of a change that a school district might face negatively regarding cash, if you were to lose money, and I know Dr. Smith, when he first started as chief financial officer, I believe had a $14 or $15 million shortfall.
$16 million,
16 million.
but who's
Excuse me.
Counting?
Who's counting?
Yeah, so it looks like a large balance for us, but in essence, when you combine our rainy day fund with our cash balance and our education fund, it's about 2 weeks worth of operating expenses. So the board has deemed it appropriate to have at least 11% operating reserve when you combine those two funds, and that's what we've had just to try to weather any shortfall that might occur in the future.
And I think something you said, and David, you've said this many times before too, it's important to keep in mind, as with any large organization, when you look at budgets and you look at some of these figures and you see tens of millions of dollars, but for an organization our size, as you said, we go through a certain amount an incredible amount just in 2 weeks of keeping everything up and running.
Yes.
Well, the allowance of
Our balance
payments
was
this
16
year was
million.
16.3 million for this 2 week
Cycle.
period of time.
Sure.
So
And the rainy day fund, really similar guidance if we always make connections, analogies to household budgets, no different than people being encouraged to always have kind of that rainy day savings in case the furnace needs
Right.
repaired or the car has a breakdown.
And Carl alluded to this, but I was approved by the school board on Monday night back in 2009 as chief financial officer and chief HR. And then the next day, the governor slashed our budget by over $6.5 million, and that was immediate. So that's why you want to have a savings account, if you will, so that you don't have to make drastic changes. You don't have to lay anybody off or things like that. So
Or
that
cut
you can make
programs that
changes.
impact
Right.
schools and kids.
Absolutely. And we've been very fortunate. No one's lost a penny out of their paycheck. Nobody's lost a job, at least since 2009.
Yeah, we certainly don't want to ever be that school district that, as you just said, is laying off people suddenly, or that is canceling programs that are beneficial to kids of
Right.
all ages. We don't want to ever be in those areas.
Yes, we are a very, very, very stable and secure school corporation.
Okay. And we'll look back at then as we move forward, more on education rainy day fund.
Yeah, so this is what we were just talking about. When you combine the education and the rainy day fund, you see our balance is at 25.3 million, which is higher than what typically would be. Again, it's because of the salary expense shift to our federal dollars. But again, it is in line with keeping at least the reserve on hand that's required.
Yes.
And then as we move through, or I believe that was it then for that.
That's it for that report. And then finally, it brings us to our self-insurance report. This is
And again, before you start, Carl, tell us again, self-insurance means what?
This is for our health insurance. We are a self-funded entity, so we are paying our own health claims out of the money that we have. We're not offloading that expense to an insurance company that's paying all of our claims. We're paying them out of pocket per se.
And we made that decision several years ago because we thought fiscally it would be much more beneficial to us as a school corporation, right, Dr. Smith?
Absolutely. Whenever we put a request for proposal out, we would always ask for a fully insured program as well as a self-insured program. Then I believe going back to about 2015, the tide shifted to where it was more advantageous for us to go from a fully insured product to a self-insured product. Now, the beauty of what we've had since 2015 is that we still use Anthem as our basically third or as our, I guess, back office support system. So they will collect the bills, they will send the bill to us, we pay it. But the great thing about that is that we get Anthem's discounts.
Mm-hmm.
I think the public knows if you happen to have, for instance, gallbladder surgery, the on the street price might be, say, $10,000 for that, but then the discounted rate that Anthem would get would be substantially discounted, maybe down to 4,500. I'm just using those as very
Sure.
broad examples. So then we pay those prices that Anthem actually negotiates on our behalf. But I don't know that our employees or anybody would really recognize that we're self-insured, because from the employee perspective, they have their Anthem insurance card. That's what they present to their medical provider, and then all of the things are billed accordingly.
And all the changes that we talk about, anytime we talk about referencing insurance or our health clinics or plan options that we have, all of those all of those were decisions we made to try to get a handle as much as possible on insurance expenses, correct? Especially over the past years when you would see those really increasing. And as an organization, we knew the more that we had to spend on our budget, the less there was to spend on other things, including employee pay increases.
Yep. I think the strategy that the board employed going back a number of years was to make the move from fully insured to self-insured. At the same time, we brought on our health and wellness clinics.
Yes.
It's a successful strategy to have both of those going at the same time, and it's one of the reasons we have that presented on this report, this quarterly report that we're looking at.
And as we've said time and again, we always want to be an employer who is able to offer top-notch health insurance and other insurances to our employees, while at the same time controlling costs.
Absolutely. So, as Carl mentioned, it was really part of a three-prong approach. One, make certain that we go to self-insured. Number two, when you do that, make certain that you have access to health and wellness centers that our insured employees can go to at no cost to them. No cost for the visit, no cost for their labs, no cost for the vast majority of the medicines. And then the third part of that strategy was to have a marketplace approach when it comes to different plan designs. So this year is the first year where we have adjusted those rates in 7 years.
Yes.
So please understand that. The first
Say that
time,
amount, or say that number of years again, if you would.
first
Dr.
time
Smith.
in 7 years that EVSC has adjusted rates for health insurance. But it wasn't just an adjustment of rates. We also went down to 4 plans to make it more cost effective, not only for us, but also for our employees. And then we have some pharmaceutical rebates that are coming on a little bit stronger this year. So we saw a very significant growth in claims over the last, I would say, 18 to 24 months. And our health insurance spend now is in the $36, $37 million range, which is very significant. So anything we can do to drive down costs in that arena allows us to put more money into our salaries and therefore into the pockets of our employees.
And it also is great for employees, too, to have those options. We've said this before, but if you're a relatively healthy 26-year-old employee, you may have a different type of option you're interested in terms of health insurance than a 59-year-old employee who maybe has some health issues or bad knees or something like that.
Correct.
Okay. Carl, I think I cut you off because I wanted to make sure you explain the basics of that. If we could put that quarterly analysis back up. Anything, though, with this that you want to tell us about?
Yeah, so it's a quarterly report. Again, it's a living document because claims for health insurance continue to come in long after the reporting period stops. This is a report kind of showing what it was at the last day of the year 2021, the 12/31 report, and we brought up the claims from 12/31 from 2020 just to have a real good apples to apples comparison. You can see the expenses in 2021 were about $29 million, and they were $30 million, really close, about $340,000 difference there. So the claims are very consistent. But claims, we will continue to receive claims going into the future, even for 2020 and 2021. For anytime those claims finally get processed, those get added back to that report. Courtney updates those on a weekly basis, and then helps puts this report together for the board.
And obviously
each quarter.
something you have to pay close attention to because a lot of money tied up in health insurance.
It's a lot of money. The thing we look closely to is the cash balance. As you can see, we had a healthy cash balance there for a while, and then it started to trend down, and now it's finally starting to tick back up. Best practice is really to have about 2 months worth of expenses in there. So hopefully we're going to continue to increase that till we can get back to that level.
So, Carl, it has trended back up because EVSC is contributing how much more this year?
Just over $5 million.
More than the previous year. That's $5 million that could go into the pockets of our employees if we're not as cost effective as we possibly can be for health insurance.
And really, your entire time being in central office, Dr. Smith, you go back to the time where you started with doing the finances and HR. I feel like that health insurance decisions regarding insurance is one of the biggest decisions that is made in terms of something that's impacting the overall budget of a school corporation.
In my experience since 2006, I know of no other expense that can fluctuate with the wide swings that we have seen health insurance. I recall there were years where our health insurance spend was predicted to go up $4, $5, $6 million, and our increased revenue from the state was going up maybe $1 million,
Right.
if that much. So it is I think, a tremendous responsibility. We want to provide the absolute best benefits that we can for our employees, and I think we are very benefit rich. But we also have to balance the cost of the benefits with the salaries that we pay our employees. When we look at overall compensation, that's I think a great story, but we always want to keep those in line.
Definitely. Well, Dr. Underwood, you've shared a lot of great information with us. I know not last night, but the previous board meeting, Dr. Smith, you actually told the trustees that we were going to do a update podcast following the next board meeting with Dr. Underwood, so you could do exactly what you've done, and that is really give us a deep dive for those individuals listening or watching who really want to understand all aspects of the finances. So we do appreciate this.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Carl. And really, this podcast, which I would guess would be well over an hour in length, if folks want to listen to the entire podcast, they can. But this was really a suggestion of several board members. Hey, can you do a podcast that goes into great depth and detail about finances and how it's done and why it's done? Something that really, even if we did in a board meeting, the ability for people to be able to start and stop the podcast to watch or listen or what have you. This way, this is a record that's out there for a long, long time. People can visit it if they choose or not, listen to just the beginning or listen to the whole thing. But I do appreciate the wealth of information that you've provided. And we just think it's important for our public to understand that we take our fiduciary responsibility for their tax dollars very, very seriously.
Well said. And then, Dr. Smith, just one more section from last night of the board meeting, continued business. And I know you provided an update to the board, just some thoughts on the ongoing pandemic.
Yes, as we see numerous school corporations in the area and in the state, in the nation, go back to virtual instruction, just want to pass along my sincere appreciation for all of our employees. It is an all hands on deck mentality. Um, as the most recent variant has seen a tremendous spike in Vanderbilt County, I think now for the last 17 or 18 days, the highest 17 or 18 days that we have experienced in a nearly 2-year period of time have occurred in the last 18 days. And school employees and school children are not immune to that. So we have teachers that are covering numerous classes. We have folks, administrators that are covering teacher classes. We have folks from central office that are covering teacher classes during lunch duty. Whatever we can to do to keep our kids in school in a safe manner, because we know how important that is for their educational benefit, as well as the disruptive force that occurs if we have to close our schools and go to virtual format. So,
And not to mention the trickle effect then that could have on
right,
other employers in the region, hospitals, you name it, if parents have
absolutely.
to stay home with young children.
Yeah, because all of our major healthcare providers have said, please, please do whatever you can to stay open, because when you shut down, we lose a lot of our nursing staff. So we understand how important that is, and we take that responsibility very, very seriously. And I just want to again publicly express my appreciation to our outstanding staff. They are getting it done in the most um, severe conditions that I have witnessed in my 40-year career.
I think that's a great point to end it on, and I know you feel very strongly about that, and you made that clear last night as well. Once again, Dr. Smith or Dr. Underwood, thank you for sharing your knowledge today. Please share again with your team how much we appreciate everything that they do to make all of the behind the scenes happen in terms of finances. They do a phenomenal job, so thank you. And Dr. Smith, thank you for spending all this time. We hope it's been helpful to those individuals that really want a deep dive. Hopefully, we've been able to provide that to them today. Until next time, we'll do another board meeting recap podcast after the next meeting. Thank you both.
Thank you.